Okay, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Muriel and Robert and the organizing committee of Origins to invite me to this meeting. It's really great to be here. Thank you. And I will talk this afternoon about the microfossil record and what we can learn from it. We are all interested here to trying to understand the origin and evolution of life on Earth and the possibilities of habitable world beyond Earth. And to try to answer these questions, we can use different approaches, as Perry has mentioned this morning. We can use the bottom-up approach, going from simple molecules to the first cells to the three domains of life. And this is the path that chemists and biologists followed, with input from astrophysicists and some geologists. And the top-down approach goes from extant life to its earliest record, and that's the path followed by biologists and geologists. And that's the path I will follow in this talk. To recognize early traces of life on early Earth, but also beyond Earth, we need to define biosignature, or better, traces of life. And these traces may include isotope fractionation that can tell us about the evolution of early metabolisms, biomarkers, which are fossil molecules that can tell us about the evolution of biosynthetic pathways, and sometimes are even specific of particular clades. Biosedimentary structures such as stromatolites or microbial mats illustrate the interactions between sediments and microorganisms. Microfossils are the direct remains of organisms. And biominerals and bioalteration of rocks are also tentatively used as traces of life. More we go deeper in the geological record, more it is difficult to prove without any ambiguities that a particular trace is indeed biological, and there are very hot debates about the oldest and the earliest traces of life. And when we try to recognize traces of life, we should carefully document the geological context in terms of environment, age, and metamorphism that may alter or erase these early traces, and keeping in mind the following questions about the preservational environments. Under what conditions do cells with varying biochemical properties do preserve? And the taphonomy, how do processes of degradation and preservation retain, alter, or erase original biological properties? Basically, how do we do from a living cell to a fossil? And how can we go backward? In the literature, a set of criteria have been developed to prove the endogenicity of a particular trace and discard the possibility of contamination, to prove its syngenicity, the fact that it has the same age as the rock that's comprising it, and the biogenicity, or to distinguish between biological and abiological traces. Because many abiotic processes may mimic life morphologies and chemistries, we can also try to think about all possible abiotic ways to explain the observation of potential traces before we can be sure that it's indeed a trace of life. In my talk, I will focus on the microfossil traces of life. There are many other possible traces to look for, and we will hear during this meeting about other possibilities. And I will look at microfossil record in fine-grained siliciclastic sediments. Why? Because this kind of sediments preserve very well organic matter, and sometimes even the original walls of fossils, as you can see here, these beautiful fossils. They also preserve sedimentary structures that may indicate aqueous habitats and processes, and they do not form an hydrothermal environment, which can preserve nice traces of life too, but also abiotic carbonaceous material. And these type of rocks preserve microfossils since at least the Middle Archean. So we use a multidisciplinary approach, combining microscale observations of the geological context with micro to nanoscale analysis of rocks, minerals, and cells. With biologists, we study recent analogs from extreme environment that are somewhat analog to early Earth conditions, such as microbial mats in Antarctica, but also we use also culture of bacteria and protists. And then we compare the morphology, ultrastructure, and chemistry of these possible analogs to Precambrian microfossils to better understand the taphonomy, the morphology, and the evolution of these early traces of life. So astrobiology, as we all know, is the study of the origin, evolution, and distribution of life in the universe. And in my talk, I will focus on the evolution and distribution aspects of astrobiology. And I will try to illustrate how the microfossil record can tell us something about two examples, to the evolution of complex life and the evolution of the first, or among the first cellular microfossils. I will then briefly make some implications for the search for life beyond Earth. Starting with our first examples, the evolution of early eukaryotes or complex life. The origin of the domain eukarya is not well constrained. Because of the chimeric nature of the eukaryotic cells, several hypotheses have been proposed to explain this origin, and these hypotheses comprise an origin between within one of the prokaryotic domains, or an association of prokaryotes, or even a position of eukaryotes at the bottom of the tree. Recently, however, a consensus has emerged among biologists. The common ancestor of extant eukaryotes, eukaryotes that live today, had a nucleus, a cytoskeleton, and mitochondria. It was an aerobic protist, and the origin of the mitochondria is bacterial in origin. This feature may help us to suggest a minimum age for these ancestors, and it requires the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis by cyanobacteria. The geological record tells us this was probably a late Archean event. We don't know the age of the ancestor of mitochondria. Molecular clocks suggest an age for the eukaryotic domain ranging between the Archean and the Middle Mesoproterozoic, and the fossil record of unambiguous eukaryotes started at 1.8 billion years ago. These ages, of course, are the age suggested for the ancestor of extant eukaryotes, but they do not need to coincide with the origin of the eukaryotic domain. Eukaryotes can leave a range of traces in the geological record. These traces include molecular fossils or biomarkers, again, sometimes specific or particular clades. They can also leave macrofossils that occur as skeletons or mold and cast of soft bodies, carbonaceous compression or permineralizations. Microfossils may occur as mineralized or organic scales, compressed or permineralized organic walls, or mineral casts. The morphology, water structure, and chemistry of these fossils may permit to relate these fossils to extant clades because they are taxonomically informative. However, in most cases, we cannot relate these fossils to extant organisms, but these characteristics of the fossil may tell us a lot about the evolution of biological innovations during the Precambrian. We can then calibrate molecular phylogenies made by biologists with this molecular and body fossil record of early eukaryotes. And we can see that after possible but discussed Archean origin of the domain, most of the supergroups of eukaryotes, except one, appeared early in the Proterozoic. This kind of work can be done, of course, with fossils that can be related to extant organisms, but the microfossil record can tell us more than that, actually. If we now examine the record of eukaryotes a different way, we can examine the timing of environmental changes through the Precambrian with the timing of biological innovations documented by the fossil and molecular record, regardless of taxonomy. And this permits us to propose a new reading of the diversification pattern of eukaryotes divided into three main periods. Period 1 starts with the origin of the domain, which is not dated, to the Middle Mesoproterozoic. It's the time of diversification of stem groups of eukaryotes and possibly some crown group. By that time, the karyotic cell had already all the characteristics of eukaryotes, with a flexible membrane, including sterols in it, a cytoskeleton, internal membranes, and a nucleus. Period 2 ranges between the middle Mesoproterozoic and the middle Neoproterozoic. It's a time of diversification of supergroup at the supergroup level, so it's really an important diversification period. During that time, major biological innovations appeared, such as multicellularity, cellular differentiation and cellular fusion, sex, eukaryotic photosynthesis, primary and secondary endosymbiosis, and heterotrophy. And these innovations led to ecological tiering and more complex food webs and interactions. The third period occurred during the Ediacaryan and is a period of diversification, but within the supergroups of eukaryotes. This period recorded more morphological diversity and left more preservable parts. The major biological innovations during that period include the evolution of tissue-grade and organ-grade multicellularity, embryogenesis, biomineralization by animals, and predation. So this work on microvassil permits to define these three periods of diversification pattern, and also to look for reasons of timing of diversification by comparing with the timing of the geological events. In the literature, most papers focus on the diversification in the Ediacaryan, but I would argue that period 2 here was really a major period for the eukaryotic evolution. Causes that are suggested to explain this diversification include the rise of animal predation, or the liberation of new ecological niches after glaciations or after meteoritic impact, or release of nutrients after a period of euxinip deep waters. This explanation may explain the diversification within supergroups in the Ediacaryan. During period 2, however, we have this diversification of supergroups that coincide with major changes also in the environment. We have formation and breakup of a supercontinent Rodinia, changes in ocean and atmosphere chemistry, and glaciations. The direct links between these environmental changes with biological changes is not clear yet, but these features contrast sharply with the quiet times of period 1 and may explain why it took so long for the eukaryotic cell to diversify after its origin. These fossils from the Proterozoic record not only tell us something about biological evolution of complex life, but also of prokaryotes that I didn't talk about, but they can also be used to define biogenicity criteria, because the biogenicity is not discussed, and we may ask ourselves what features led to the agreement that they are indeed biological. They can also help us to develop sampling and analysis strategy to look for life in older rocks. To look for life in older rocks, we went to the Moody's group in the Barberton Green Soil Belt of South Africa, which has been described as the Earth's oldest siliciclastic alluvial and two tidal estuarine deposits. These rocks are very well dated at 3.2 billion years ago. The geological context is extensively studied. They comprise more than 3 kilometers thick of conglomerate sandstone, siltstone with lesser amount of shales, basalt, and iron formation. They are low metamorphic grade, and they demonstrate geographic extent, so they are a nice target to look for early traces of life. We studied 5 records of interlaminated sandstone, gray siltstones, and mudstones. These rocks show a set of sedimentary structures such as fraser bedding, cross bedding, migrating wave ripples or current ripples, showing that we are in a shallow water above waste-based environment, so a geological context plausible for life. We discovered a population of spheroidal carbonaceous microstructures in thin sections cut parallel to bedding and perpendicular to bedding. The structures are flattened parallel to bedding. These features demonstrate the endogeneity of these microstructures. The microstructure occur as a population with a unimodal size distribution of diameter ranging between 30 and 300 micron in diameter, which is quite large. Micro-Raman spectroscopy of the structure in the rock, the structure extracted from the rock, and particulate carbonaceous material within the same rocks. A spectra of disordered carbonaceous material comparable to spectra of this kind of material from green schist metamorphisms. So these analyses show that the microstructures are indeed carbonaceous in composition, and they are syngenetic to the rock as they have the same thermal maturity as the hosting rock. Carbon isotope analysis reveal values that are similar to other values reported for all the geological timescale, and also that are consistent with biologically produced organic matter. Oh, sorry. We extracted some of these structures with a gentle acid maceration to observe better their morphology, and we saw that they have structurally distinct carbonaceous cell walls. They are made of kerogen. They show features of soft wall deformation, such as folding here or wrinkling. You can see better here on the scanning electron microscopy pictures. These are made with transmitted light microscopy. And they have a cellular morphology, and they also have the same color as the surrounding particulate carbonaceous material, which is again a criteria for syngenicity. By comparison, you can see here a younger microfossil from the Mesoproterozoic by transmitted light microscopy and scanning electron microscopy. Transmission electron microscopy show that these microstructures are not just kerogen particles, but they are indeed hollow flattened vesicles. You can see here the two compressed wall with the cell lumen inside here. Again, here a comparison with a younger microfossil from the Mesoproterozoic with the two cell walls and the internal space of the cells in between here. Because many abiotic processes can produce spheroidal pseudofossils, we try to think about any possible abiotic ways to make these structures. And it is known that, for example, self-assembling vesicle can form in the lab from abiotic carbonaceous material. For example, in prebiotic chemistry experiments, or with fluids from meteoritic inputs or from hydrothermal sources. Artifacts of preparation of maceration of material can also produce pseudofossils, or migration of abiotic or biotic carbonaceous material along microfractures in the rocks or along mineral cast or around silica spheres formed in silica saturated water, or even inside gas bubbles above microbial mats. All these processes may produce spheroidal pseudofossils. However, these processes do not explain the observation we made of large organic wall, flattened, hollowed vesicle preserved in fine-grained, shallow water sediments. They either do not occur in the right geological conditions or would not produce the right taphonomy, nor the right chemistry, nor the right size or unimodal size distribution. So we think these fossils are indeed microfossils. And this study shows that in the Mesoarchean, large resistant organic cell walls or colonial envelopes were preserved in the photic zone of 3.2 billion years old marginal marine siliciclastic environments, close to previously reported benthic microbial mats. This study also showed that siliciclastic rocks are an interesting target to look for life in all the rocks on Earth, but possibly also beyond Earth. So there might be an interesting target for astrobiology. These examples from the geological record and many other biological studies that are made by some people in the audience here and outside of this audience show that geobiology may provide a rationale for defining diagnosis criteria for microfossils, to document crucial steps in life evolution and to look for life on Earth, but also beyond Earth. If we look at the record of life on Earth, or only biological planet, the only example we can look at, we can document important steps in life evolution through time, and then think about what we could look for beyond Earth and how, by which instruments or by which means. The most probable form of life we could find elsewhere, if there is life elsewhere, is microbial life. And for that, if we look at what we do on Earth, we know that we have to land on the planet and look for it in situ, with all the precautions and difficulties I just illustrated. And this can be done only around us in the solar system. To look for life a little bit further away, we can look at the atmosphere of exoplanets by remote sensing and try to find gases that may be biological in origin. However, if we look at the history of the atmospheric evolution on Earth, although life influenced atmospheric composition very early, the detection of biological gases that can be unambiguously discriminated from other abiotic gases is difficult, and this occurs on Earth only very late in the history of the planet, once oxygenic photosynthesis appears. If we want to go further from even the close space around us, we can look for signs of technologically intelligent life, which is the less likely if we consider the time it took for us. It just appeared. And ironically, it's the kind of life we can look around us in a broader space. Several missions are being developed now to look for life on Mars. And if we look at the examples I just illustrated, I would argue that ancient Martian phyllosilicate deposit would be an interesting target to try to find traces of life, because they preserve sedimentary structure that can indicate aqueous processes and habitats. They may have a role in prebiotic chemistry, but very interestingly, they have a high preservation potential of organic matter and possible signs of life. However, as we have seen, finding unambiguous traces of life on Earth and beyond requires multiple macro and microscale multidisciplinary analysis within the geological context, which is really important. This is my last slide. These kind of studies, geobiological studies, combined with information from astrophysicists, geophysicists, basically all the astrobiology community, can help us to understand the conditions for planetary habitability. For life as we know it, it seems that the presence of water and its chemical properties are very crucial, but that's not enough. The time scale on which the liquid water persists on the planet is also important, and this timing is related to major planetary events and to geodynamic processes. These geodynamic processes are really important to maintain liquid water at the surface of a planet and also to ensure replenishing of nutrients necessary for life. I think we will hear more about this in the future talks. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thanks again to the organizers, to many people with whom I discuss or collaborate, and for financial support. Thank you.